Yo, yo, it's Q, what it do? Coming at you with another video. And this time we're going to be talking about the smartest MBTI, and that's the INTJ. So have a nice day, everyone. But really, let's go into that a little bit. So when we're talking about smartest, we need to define the word smart. That can mean a number of different things to different people. Some people might see smart as like book smart, where somebody who knows like a lot of information and knowledge. Some people might see it as street smart, somebody who's good at talking to other people, selling them, getting along with other people, that kind of thing. So there's different ways to define it. It might be kind of more of a technical ability, like just being able to crunch numbers and be really good at math. It might be a good writer. It might be really creative person who's able to come up with new ideas and innovate and these kind of things. So there's lots of different ways to define it, and it somewhat does depend on the task at hand. So I'm going to give you kind of my take on it, and we will work with that in regards to the MBTI, although it's not just my take. You could take a lot of these definitions, and I think they would still kind of work with the way I'm going to tie it into MBTI. So one way people also talk about is IQ. And I think IQ is a pretty good indicator. I don't think it's the only indicator, but if you actually understand kind of how IQ works and how it takes into account what's called the G factor, which is for general intelligence, and when you kind of see how IQ is not just a measure of like one small thing, it's actually a measure of lots of different ways to measure intelligence, and it brings it all into kind of one basic measurement. You'll see that IQ actually is a pretty good indicator, and when we talk later about multiple intelligences, that kind of ties in with IQ. So I'm going to talk about influence, because I think influence is a decent way to define smart. So if you were to go onto Google and search for most influential people throughout history, you're going to get names that people would probably expect, like Albert Einstein, Isaac Newton, scientist type people. You're going to get Steve Jobs probably in there, maybe Bill Gates, some business type people. You're going to get some artists in there, maybe Pablo Picasso or Leonardo da Vinci, things like that. You'll get Jesus, of course. You'll get maybe some people say Muhammad. You might get Gandhi in there. So you're going to get kind of a wide range of people from different spheres of influence, but they're all kind of influential in different ways. And I think most people would say all of these people were smart. And then if you were to also type in something like the smartest people throughout history, you're going to still end up with a very similar list to that of the influential people throughout history. So I think influence is a pretty good way to measure smart. So yeah, let's continue on with that. So with MBTI, there are four main dichotomies, right? You got the S and the N, you got the E and the I, the T and the F, and the J and the P. So all of these tie in with influence. So I think we should first kind of break down of these four dichotomies, which side is kind of more intelligent. And then from there, we can kind of determine which types are the most intelligent and the least intelligent. So in regards to this, the SN relationship, the S and the N, in my opinion, is by far the most important part of the MBTI in determining intelligence. And I've done another video about this, and I go directly into that on how the N is more intelligent than the S. And of course there are exceptions, and you can't make like an overarching rule to say that N's are always smarter, but in general, N's are smarter. And I kind of go into that in that video, but I'll go into it a little bit here. But to do that, let's talk about multiple intelligences, right? Because a lot of people will bring up that there's multiple intelligences, like musical intelligence, visual intelligence, verbal, logical, bodily, interpersonal, intrapersonal, naturalistic, existential, and other stuff too. But let's just kind of deal with these a little bit. So of all of these things, musical, visual, verbal, logical, the rest of them, they all favor the N as being better, except for maybe bodily and kinesthetic. But it's kind of interesting because bodily and kinesthetic is basically control or intelligence over your body, like dancing, sports, things like that. And if you're going as broad as to define somebody who's athletic as being smart, I think you might be taking intelligence in a direction that might be kind of taking it too far maybe. I mean, I could understand how athletic people are smart, but calling bodily intelligence as kind of putting it on the same level as logical or verbal or visual, it's a different type of smart. And it just seems like if you have to make the definition that broad, you're not happy with the way the definition for intelligence already is. You're trying to redefine it in a way that's beneficial for you because you're not intelligent. It just seems like a misuse of the word. But either way, these other things, musical, visual, blah, 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 they're all kind of in favor of the N. And this goes into the G factor with IQ, because people who are good at most of these things are also going to have a high G factor, which means they're going to have a high IQ. So all these different intelligences aren't really different insofar as the G factor measures them very similarly. So high IQ people are good at all these things. And I mean, if you were to just kind of go through some of these, N's are usually better at them anyway. Like, I mean, existential, which is kind of like spiritual. N's are much more into that kind of thing or better at it than S's. I mean, that's like kind of the definition of an N, is they kind of look at non-physical things. So they're already, that's what N's do. Intrapersonal, like working on yourself. That's something N's are more likely to do than an S. Interpersonal, being good with people and kind of relationships and feeling them, and that NFs are freaking really good at that. Bodily kinesthetic, S's probably have the edge on that one. Okay. Logical, mathematical, of course, N's crush that. NTs will freaking dominate math and logical things. Verbal, so verbal N's are really good at. NFs are great writers, great communicators, these kind of things. NTs as well. Visual, spatial, so you know, these kind of things, N's again very good at. And musical, you have a lot of good N's at music. You have good S's at music too. Again, I'm painting a very broad brush. Of course there's exceptions and there are, you know, other non-N's that are good at these things, but in general the N's, I would give the edge on most of these things, which correlates with IQ, which correlates with G factor, which ties in with influence. So let's continue on a little bit with this. Okay, so continuing on with this SN relationship, the N's, they're more innovative, they're more creators, they build things, so they're kind of more like most people who start businesses and kind of this type of thing are going to be N's, where S's are more so going to be employees that work for N's and businesses that N's create, and S is much less likely to create a business, and creating a business is much more likely to be something that's influential or something that's beneficial for more people. The N's are more likely to go against tradition, so they're the ones who are going to see kind of a fault in tradition and have kind of the risk or the guts to actually want to create something new or to create change in a system that an S would be kind of more complacent to go along with. So this is something that is influential and that I would say is smart. So yeah, and then it's interesting, if you look at the way they group N's versus the way they group S's. So an N will be grouped as like an NT or an NF, where the S's aren't grouped this way. They're going to be grouped as an SP or an SJ, and that in itself is already telling. So grouping with a T or an F is grouping it more of in a mental intelligence way, in a non-physical way. A J or the P has to do more with the physical world, where a J is kind of, well, J and the P are both kind of how you see things as far as whether something is organized, whether something is kind of, whether you're open to how something is physically, or it's not having to do with your thinking or your kind of emotional faculties, where the N, being an NT, is, you know, the thinking side, and then the NF is kind of more the feeling side, but you don't have an ST or an SF, just like you don't have an NJ or an NP. I mean, you can, but that's not the way they group them. And they group them the way they do for a reason, because it fits in with the way that they operate in the world. And the N's are more focused on the T and the F in that way, where the S's are more the J or the P. So the J or the P is more of a physical type thing, and the T or the F is more of a non-physical, kind of before it takes form type of thing that you then bring into reality. So all this kind of ties in with intelligence and influence. And that's an interesting thing to consider if you're an N, because if you're an S, you might not consider it. So in that regard, the N, I would definitely give a huge edge to intelligence. And if I had to put a number on it, I would say the SN relationship is 85% of intelligence in regards to MBTI. So whether you're an S or the N is like by far the most important thing to determine whether a type is intelligent or not. So 85% of it is whether you're an S or an N. The other 15% is now on this next stuff we're going to talk about. So let's go into that. Then the next biggest group is what I would say is the E and the I. Again, this is all my opinion. Take it as you will, but I'm not pulling this opinion out of nowhere. I've looked at this for like a long time and talked to a lot of different people about it. So it's not like I'm giving my opinion just to give it. I have something to say that I think needs to be said, and I'd like to share it with you. So we got the E and the I. So this now, I would say, accounts for about 10% of intelligence in regards to MBTI. So you have a lot of influential E's and you have a lot of influential I's, and they influence in kind of different ways. The E's are usually more outward. They're going to be kind of the people you see and that you hear more about, where the I's are kind of more behind the scenes, and they're influencing kind of more that way. They might influence with like a scientific discovery or some philosophical breakthrough, where an E might do some type of military influence, or they might do some type of political leadership thing where they influence that way. They're kind of more the front men, and the I's are kind of more behind the scenes working and doing that type of influence. So you could also say a lot of the E's are put in place by the I's. So the I's kind of know what they want to have happen. They might have like some type of political change they want to take place, but rather than do that themselves and be the outward person, they'll just hire somebody, put that person in the public view to do that, and that person will take all the heat and all the responsibility and everything. And the I can sit back and kind of be a number of things. They can kind of hide themselves, but they can also bring more people in to do more work for them rather than doing it all themselves. So something to think about. Now, another interesting part with the E and the I is that, and so the MBTI definition of what makes an E or the I is where you derive your energy. And they will say that the E's derive their energy from people, and the I's do not. The I's derive their energy kind of from themselves. The I's need to recharge alone, where the E's need to recharge around other people. And this is kind of telling in a way, because it shows that the E's in a way are dependent on I's, where the I's are not dependent on E's. So the E's need the I's, but the I's don't need the E's. The I's can just be by themselves and be okay with that. So in that sense, the I is kind of more simplified, or it has less kind of weight to carry with itself. And that to me is a more beneficial, more influential thing. If you can kind of do something more simplified and you don't have kind of an extraneous other thing that's required, there's less parts with an I. And you could also say, this might be taking it a little bit far, but you could also say in a way it's more spiritual, where the I kind of recharges through the universe and through themselves and through meditation and that kind of thing, where the E, not so much. They kind of get that second hand from the I. So the I kind of gets it, and then they pass it over to the E, and the E kind of gets it from the I. So in that regard, I would give the I the edge as far as intelligence when you're coming E versus I. Obviously, it matters a lot less than the S and the N. And it obviously matters at the task at hand, because obviously E's are better at a lot of things than I's. and I's are better at a lot of things than E's. So it kind of depends, but in general, if you had to choose one that's smarter, more influential than the other, I'm gonna say I. Okay, so moving along to the next group, which I say is 5% of the mix. So S in the N is 85, that's like pretty much everything. But if you want to nitpick and get more detailed, which I do, then you'll get into the T and the F, or sorry, the E and the I, which is about 10%, which I'd give the edge to the I. And then the next 5% is between the T and the F. So this is even smaller group than the E and the I, but let's explore that a little bit. So the T and the F. Now I have a simple way of kind of explaining this. I say the T's are into things and the F's are into people. So this pretty much is an easy way to distinguish the two. The T's, they want to build things, or they're into like cars, mechanical things, computers, technology, non-people things. They just want to, you know, play video games or do anything like that. And the F's are all about people and things that have souls, let's say, or kind of human or animal or any type of non-T things. So they're into people and animals and stuff like that, and that's what the F's will prioritize around, and that's what they will care about, and that's kind of their main love and interest. And the T's not so much. T's care more about stuff. So let's keep that in mind when talking about this. So there's an interesting way to put this. So you have the T, which you could say is kind of more logical or into reason or these types of things. And it's not to say that the F's aren't. It's just to say that the T's will kind of put that first. And the F's are more into emotion and feelings and kind of these things. And it's not to say that one is better or worse than the other, unless you kind of could say that, which let's explore that. So animals. So if we're talking about, let's say, evolution in a way, where you have something like an animal, like I don't know, like a bear, a dog, whatever, and then you have a human. These are both animals, right? But what is the difference between a human like myself or like you and between a dog? And the difference is not necessarily emotion, because dogs and animals in general have emotion. Anybody, whether they're a T or an F, has emotion. Any like entity that's living, more so animal and human, has emotion. Now, does a dog have reason? Are they able to kind of reflect on themselves? Are they able to kind of go beyond their emotion? And I think you could argue they maybe do to a small degree, but definitely not to the degree that a human does. Otherwise, they would be doing many of the things humans do. And that goes for any animal. So in that way, and in my view, I see reason, which I think could be attributed more to T's, as being a kind of higher form of intelligence than feeling. Feeling is kind of puts you online with animals and things of this order. But when you go beyond an animal into a human, that's where you have this kind of self-awareness, more logical, more reasoning ability, where you actually kind of reflect on things and can think about them. And this is more of a T thing in my view. And because of that, I would give T's the edge. Now again, I could be totally wrong about this. It could be the other way, where the feeling aspect actually is more important and your emotions are more important than your logic. And if that is the case, then the F's would be more intelligent. I don't think it's the case, but it could be, and if it is, then put the F above the T. But so in that regard, I'm going to give the T the edge when it comes to intelligence over the F. And let's continue on. So we've already covered like 100%, 85% for the S and the N, E and the I 10%, T and the F 5%. So we have the J and the P left, and there may be some, I mean, it depends kind of on the application, I think, the difference between which one is more intelligent or less intelligent. And in general, I kind of think they're about equal, because they both have pros and cons in a kind of a way where they both balance each other out. So if you go back to the S and the N, I don't think they both balance each other out. I think the N is kind of like a higher level than an S, and I know that's going to upset a lot of people, and I'm sorry, that's just my view. So it's like, so an S is like a 3rd grader doing math, and the N is like a 12th grader doing math. It's like the N can do this 3rd grader math, but the 3rd grader can't do this 12th grader math. So it's not that they're opposites, kind of where they both have pros and cons. It's where one is kind of higher and one's lower. So I don't see them as contrasting opposites. I see one as kind of a higher magnitude, where when you come to the J and the P, and most of the other stuff as well, like E and I, T and F, but especially the J and the P, I see them more as kind of just opposites, where it really is preference, where one isn't necessarily better or worse, or more intelligent or more influential or not. They really do have pros and cons in both ways. So yeah, you could say that P's are going to be a bit more creative, and they're going to be better at innovating and kind of coming up with things that are, so the J's are more concrete and better at getting stuff done. The P's, in contrast, are better at not getting things done, but coming up with ideas, and kind of, when you do that, when you're not trying to force something, you're better able to have something kind of come to you, and that's what P's are really good at. So they're good at creating and letting things come to them, letting innovations come to them, where the J's are good at taking those things from the P's and then putting them into actual practice. And they're both important, and there's arguments to say which one is better or worse than the other. You could say that actually producing something and getting something done is better, but you could also say that creating something and coming up with an idea, whether or not you act on it or not, is more important. And if I had to give a slight edge to something, I favor creativity more than anything, so I would put the P like a slight edge maybe, because I do think creativity is kind of almost more even of like an N thing, where you're pulling something from a non-physical reality and you're bringing it into kind of like a physical reality. Whether or not you create it or not, it doesn't matter. You're at least creating that thought that now somebody can take and kind of move forward with in a more J way or whatever. But again, they're both like very similar. So I'd put them pretty much even, and that is what I do. So it doesn't really matter if you're a J or the P, because they're both going to be really good in different ways. Okay, so now there is a big problem with everything I've said that throws a huge monkey wrench in everything I've been saying, and that is the functions. And the functions undo everything I said, so sorry. Just kidding, because the functions actually say the exact same thing that I'm saying. And when I talk about this stuff, everybody always says, what about the functions? What about the functions? You need to talk about the functions because that's what matters most. Okay, so I'm already talking about intuition as being the main thing when it comes to intelligence. And if you look at the functions for every N, their primary or secondary function is going to be intuition. And then if you look at every S, their third or fourth function is going to be intuition. And then it's reversed if you look at the third or fourth function for N's, which is going to be sensing. And the first or second function for the S's is going to be sensing. So the N's already prioritize as their dominant or secondary function as intuition, where the sensors don't. And if you consider intuition as being the most important part for influence, which I do, then the S's, it's going to be hard for them to be that because they don't have intuition first or second. They have it third or fourth, so they'd have to develop their third or fourth in a way to where it becomes more prominent. And that is, I don't know, so whatever. That is not really the case with them. Could they develop it and could they become more N? Absolutely. And I think that's kind of, well, I don't want to get into that, but yeah, they could. And then if you look at the N, their main thing is going to be intuition. That's their primary or secondary function. So you're going to see that, and sensing is going to take a back seat because it's just not as important to them. They care more about a kind of non-physical or a more, I guess you could say spiritual in a way, but not necessarily spiritual, but just more kind of idea, kind of pattern recognition, just non-concrete in the S way, more non-physical or beyond physical type way, where the S's are more kind of physical, which can be limiting in a lot of ways if you look at a lot of influential people, who by the way are N's. If you check out my video on that, you'll see that almost everybody who's influential in history is an N. And that's not a coincidence. But what I'm saying is that the N's prioritize towards N and the S's don't. And if N is more important, the N's are going to have that in the cognitive functions. And then you'll see, T and F, like extroverted thinking, extroverted feeling, all these different kind of supplemental parts with N's, which are kind of more these preferences on how you use your intuition, which are kind of inconsequential more so, because the main thing is that N part. And if you wanted to get technical, you kind of could break it down to whether you're extroverted or introverted, right? So if intuition is important, and if introversion has an edge over extroversion, then somebody who leads with introverted intuition is probably going to be the most smart, right? And then conversely, somebody who's extroverted sensing is probably going to be least intelligent, or at least less intelligent than the introverted intuitive person. And this all is cognitive function stuff, and they illustrate this exact thing, right? So the introverted intuitive people, like the INTJ and the INFJ, those people are probably going to be pretty freaking smart, because that is their kind of main primary function, which coincides with kind of what I've been talking about. So with that said, let's actually rank these from least intelligent to to most intelligent. Now, because like I said, the J and the P are so kind of inconsequential, I've grouped those kind of in the same group. So somebody like a ENFP, ENFJ, I'm going to put them on the same level, just because the J and the P to me aren't that much of a distinguishing factor to kind of really put one above the other. So rather than having 1 through 16, I'm going to have 1 through 8. And we'll start with number 8, who I would say is the least intelligent. And that is going to go towards, again, so least intelligent. It's going to be an S, it's going to be in E, it's going to be an F, and the J or the P doesn't matter. So what are you left with? You have the ESFP and the ESFJ. So that is number 8. Number 7. So here you're going to have the ESTP and the ESTJ. And then moving on to the introverts now, you're going to have at the number 6 spot, you have the ISFP and the ISFJ. And then when you move to the most intelligent sensors, you're going to have in the number 5 spot, the ISTP and the ISTJ. And I think a lot of sensors would agree that the ISTJ is probably the smartest sensor. And that's why I have them right there with the ISTP as the 5th smartest. But yeah, again, if you were to kind of change some of these around where you might put F above T, then you might kind of flip some of these. So it's not perfect, obviously, it's kind of my take, but I think it makes sense. And it also, if you were to kind of look more into this, it correlates very closely with IQ, what I'm saying right here. So IQ is like pretty much saying this same exact thing, if you think IQ matters, which I kind of do. So now we're moving on to the N's, which are the 1 through 4 spot. So at the 4th spot, you have the ENFP and the ENFJ. So these are the least intelligent N's, but I would still place them more intelligent than any S in general. Of course, there are exceptions. Okay, the 3rd most intelligent would be the ENTP and the ENTJ. And this is interesting because I know some people might put these actually probably at the number 2 spot, but this is very arguable. You could go kind of either way and have very valid points for either one. So it's kind of hard to say. And well, let me bring up number 2. So number 2, INFP and INFJ. So in this way, I'm putting the INFP and the INFJ above the ENTP and ENTJ, which a lot of people would have a beef with. And that's understandable, and you have a very valid reason to believe that, and I don't have a problem with that. But I personally would put the INFJ above the ENTJ. And I could kind of, well, let me talk a little bit about that, because in a way, so the INFJ and the INFP, so especially the INFJ, they have kind of like more of a precision way of using feeling, where, so if you're I, you're going to be kind of more accurate with something, where an E is kind of sloppy, or not, they're more, so an ENTJ to an INTJ is going to be more sloppy on kind of what they do than an INTJ. INTJs are very precise, and so if you look at an INFJ compared to an ENTJ, INFJs are like an INTJ. They're very precise, but not with things, but with people and with feelings. So the INTJ is a very accurate feeler, where the ENTJ is a less accurate thinker. And I would think accuracy in feeling is more important than a little bit less accuracy in thinking. This is, I don't know, kind of weird and kind of nitpicky or whatever, but that's my take. And again, there's arguments both ways. But let's get to the number 1 spot. So now you have at number 1, of course, the INTP and the INTJ. And it's interesting because I think very, very many people would agree with me that the INTP or the INTJ are pretty much the smartest. I think if you go to most forums and places, you kind of see that, and nobody really has a problem with that, especially if looking at it from like an IQ or technical ability. But yeah, there's arguments that maybe they're not and that kind of thing, and that's totally fine. This is, again, kind of my take. But yeah, it's quite interesting to look at in that regard. Yeah, there's always exceptions to it. This is not like a technical science, but MBTI in general isn't really a science. It's just kind of a theory of preferences and kind of different patterns that can be recognized and that kind of thing. And then also, most people who take the test, a lot of people kind of lie on how they take the test. So the type that they might end up might be different than what they really are, because they kind of force on what they want to be. So they'll project that and answer accordingly to that, and they might not really be that. There's kind of lots of different things to this that might not make it as accurate as we might think it is. You know, somebody might go along for a long time thinking that they're an S when they're really an N, or vice versa. And so you know, it's not perfect, but it does have value, and it does have kind of different patterns and things that can be ascertained by looking into it and researching it. So I just wanted to share that with you, and I hope there was some value in that for you. I don't want to say this is correct. I just want to say this is something to kind of work with and put in with your own personal kind of perspective, and kind of build from that and add to what you already have. I don't think a lot of people talk about this stuff, which I find discouraging, because you'll hear a lot of people talk about kind of the more superficial things when it comes to MBTI, like who is more into partying, or who is more into kind of building businesses, or who's more spiritual, or who's more whatever. But nobody ever really talks about who's more intelligent. And when they do, people get upset about it, because it starts to get really personal. And for whatever reason, intelligence really is a personal thing that people really get upset about. It's really, it's kind of like a tough thing to talk to a lot of people about. But that's what I'm here doing, talking about it. So what is the smartest MBTI? I would have to say the INTP and the INTJ. And of course, if you disagree with me, you're wrong. So have a nice day, everyone.